Hi everyone. Okay, welcome to tonight's session on the AP Calculus exams. Today, Elizabeth Zhu is going to be running you guys through the AP Calculus exams. She's a good friend and classmate of mine, and she obviously got a 5 on this exam. And before we begin, I would just like to say, as usual, a big thank you to everyone who has donated to the MGH so far. Okay, so Elizabeth is going to take it from here.
Can you guys see me? Okay, cool. Hi, my name is Elizabeth, and today, as you can see by the title, we're going to have an intro into the AP Calculus, AB, and BC exams. So a little bit about myself. I'm a senior going to college next year, and I took the BC exam last year after taking the course at school. So a little overview of what we're going to be talking about today. In the beginning, we will have a quick overview of what an AP is. I'm sure many of you guys probably already know what an AP exam is, or some of you guys might have already taken one. But for those of you who haven't, I'll just do a quick overview, a quick summary of what an AP exam is. And then in the second part, we will be discussing the differences between the AB and BC exam. So yes, there are two different types of calculus exams, the AB and the BC, and we'll go over the differences and similarities of them and hopefully help you choose which one you might want to take. And then in the third section, we'll talk about how each of them are structured. We'll go over the format of the test, how we normally take it, and also the one for this year for the COVID-19. So they've restructured it a little bit. So we'll talk about that and discuss the timing and the different sections that might be tested on. Then we'll talk about how each of them are scored. And then the bulk of this presentation will be going over each of the units and the topics under each unit. And if we have time, we can do a couple example questions. And then we'll discuss how to prepare for the test and how I personally prepared for it. And then I'll leave you guys off with some tips and tricks that have really helped me. So what is an AP exam? So an AP exam stands for the Advanced Placement Exam. And according to the College Board, the AP exams are standardized exams designed to measure how well you've mastered the content and skills of a specific AP course. So many colleges and universities will give you college credit for a score of 3 or higher, but some also require 4 to 5. It just depends on which college. And actually, AP exams can allow you to leap over introductory courses and jump right into more advanced courses. So if that's why you're taking it, then we can discuss it a little bit later. For the differences between the AB and BC exam, as you can see from the chart here, in the middle column, the AB exam only covers units 1 through 8, whereas the BC exam covers units 1 through 10. And the only main difference between the two exams is the number of topics, not so much the depth in which each test goes into each of the exams. Again, for college credit, if you're taking it for college credit, while most students opt to take the AB exam because they might find it somewhat easier, just know that a lot of colleges require that you take the BC exam, or at least the BC exam is worth more credit at many universities. So definitely keep that in mind when you're choosing whether you want to take the AB or BC exam. For the format, so this is the format for the normal test. You're probably not taking it next week, but for normally this is how it's sort of structured. So each of the tests, no matter if you're taking A, B, or BC, the timing will be 3 hours and 15 minutes long. It's pretty long. And it'll be scored from 1 through 5. So as you can see from the top graph or the top chart, you want a higher number because a 5 means that you're extremely well qualified, whereas a 1 means you don't really get a recommendation for a credit. Just know that for the format of the test, there are two main sections, the multiple choice section and the free response section. This graph or this chart lays it out pretty nicely, but within each of the sections, there is a calculator section and a no calculator section. And although the no calculator section might be quite daunting, Just know that the no calculator sections are actually designed so that you won't need a calculator. So the algebra or the math that is in it is pretty straightforward, and you definitely won't need a calculator. And speaking about a calculator, most calculators we use in class are permitted on the test, but I do know that the College Board has a list of calculators that they will allow. So I would double check if I were you to see if your calculator before you bring it to the test and they don't let you take it in, just to make sure that it's permitted. Going on to how it's normally scored. So it's normally scored again from 1 through 5. And the multiple choice questions are handled by a machine. So a machine will see if they're correct with the bubbles and everything. Then for the free response questions, they are scored by an AP reader. And AP readers are usually trained experts who spend a week of intense training to prepare for this. So they're quite equipped for it. And usually they're given a rubric, a pretty extensive rubric of what is expected of the students and exactly how many points they deserve for what they have. So it's more objective. And also the free response sections, just know that all of the questions are given equal weight. Though just know that the sections under each question, so if you had 1A and 1B, those might not be equal weights, but question 1, question 2, etc., those will be weighted equally. Now for the format adjusted for COVID-19, this year, as we're all stuck in quarantine, the test will be 45 minutes long. It'll be in May 12th, so just a couple days away. So that's why I'm assuming that not many of you guys are here for this one, but just in case you are, it'll be on May 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And it will be open book and open note exam based entirely on free response questions. And they say that no calculators are required, but they are allowed. So you can use it if you want, but you won't need them. And what will be on the test, there will just be 2 free response questions. The first one will be a little bit longer and be 60% of your score. And the second one will be shorter and only be worth 40% of your score. And some extra info that the College Board has put out is they have a keyboarding tip sheet, I believe, that will provide you with suggestions on how to type mathematical symbols. Because most of the time in the free response, I don't know if you guys know this, but most of the answers are typed on. Although they do allow, if you want to write it on paper, you can take a picture and upload it as well, and that works. And a few topics will actually not be present in this exam for this year, just because many schools who aren't able to be open right now and aren't able to teach their students the later units, they won't be able to understand a lot of the later units. So the College Board wanted to be super accommodating. And so some of the later units won't be tested this year, and we can go over that when we go through each of the units. So this is a chart of the different topics that you might find on the test. As you can see clearly here, the BC exam covers 10 units, whereas the AB exam only covers 8. I also mentioned that a little bit before. And one main difference, I guess you could see between the two of them, is that on the normal test, the BC exam is weighted more on some of the later units, such as Unit 9, obviously in Unit 10, but also in I guess everything else is the same except for Unit 9 and Unit 10. I guess I misread that earlier, but this chart is super helpful in letting you know what sort of big topics that you definitely want to study depending on which test you're taking. So for example, if you were taking the AB, as you can see, Unit 6 is going to take up 17 to 20% of the exam, so you definitely want to make sure that you study that one, and also Unit 5. Whereas if you're taking BC, you'll see that Unit 6, 9, and 10 really take up the bulk of the percentage of your score, so you would definitely want to focus on those 3 units. So going into the specific units, as you can see here, I just listed out some of the topics that the College Board has posted. Unit 1 will be on limits and continuity. So you'll need to know how to define units using limit notation, estimate limits from graphs and tables, determining limits using algebraic properties of limits, algebraic manipulation and the squeeze theorem, discontinuities, continuities at a point and over an interval, and then you have the intermediate value theorem. So it's really important that you understand the earlier units super well, because without a good foundation of calculus or knowledge of the earlier units, such as the basic of limits or discontinuities, it's really difficult to understand the later units. So units like the beginning units, you definitely need to get a handle of. Here's an example question. We won't really have time to go through every single question that we have, but we can definitely go over each of them sort of generally and how they fit into each unit and how we might see them in the test. So these questions are all found on College Board, so you'll know that these are what they're sort of looking for and sort of what to expect on a test as well. In this question, this is just one of the questions that could be on Unit 1. So I just wanted to give you guys an example of a question that you might find on the topics in Unit 1, but just because you might know how to solve this one doesn't mean that you know how to solve every single question on Unit 1. So just know that because Unit 1 is quite lengthy and broad, this is just one example out of many. This is one of the easier questions that you might find on the first section. So this would be found in section 1A, the no calculator section. So you should be able to solve this without a calculator. Now continuing on to Unit 2, this is differentiation, definition, and fundamental properties. You'll be expected to know the definition, average, and instantaneous rates of change at a point, estimating derivatives at a point, determining when derivatives do and do not exist, and the derivative rules. So for example, the power rule, the constant sum difference rules. You would be expected to know how to find the derivative of trig functions, e to the x and ln of x, as well as the product and quotient rules. And as you see here with the derivative rules that you have to memorize, there are quite a lot of different rules and theorems that you would have to memorize just throughout the units. So unlike other AP tests, such as the stats tests or the chemistry tests, you actually won't be provided with a formula sheet on the AP exam for calculus. So just know that it's super important to memorize the ones that you need to know. And one way of doing so, actually there are a lot of different resources that you could find online that have study sheets on AP calculus formulas. So you can search those up online. There are a ton of them. And it'll just help you find which ones you need to memorize. Another easy way that was personally really helpful for me, and I just sort of automatically did it in class, was just doing a lot of questions. Because when you do a lot of practice questions, you'll just get to practice using these formulas, and you'll automatically sort of memorize them in the back of your mind while you're doing them. So that's super helpful, a tip. For a question like this, this is a great example of how some questions can build off of previous units, because in this question, it makes you determine when a derivative does and does not exist, so that goes with Unit 2. But it also refers back to Unit 1, such as when the question asks about the continuity and when the function is continuous and when it's not. So this question can be found in the no calculator section, because I mean, you don't really need a calculator here. There's no excuse for a calculator. You can't really graph it. But yeah. For Unit 3, this will be on differentiation, so composite, implicit, and inverse functions. So as you can see here, you're expected to know the chain rule, how to implicit differentiate, how to differentiate inverse functions, and calculating higher order derivatives. So from the chain rule here, as you can see, I'm not sure if many of you guys know what the chain rule is or if you guys have taken the class already, but the chain rule basically builds off of a lot of the previous units, because for the chain rule, you actually need to know the different derivative formulas, such as the product rule and the quotient rule that I just mentioned before, and in order to use the chain rule and in order to use the different formulas that you learn in later units. In this question here, this is an example of implicit differentiation, and this is really important to understand how to differentiate an equation when both x and y are present. And a question like this would also be found in the no calculator section. Also, if you're interested in actually solving some of these questions that I'm just breezing by, you can always just take a screenshot or check out the video when it's on YouTube. For Unit 4, this is about contextual applications of differentiation. So some of the things that you are expected to know are interpreting the meaning of the derivative in context. You should know straight line motion, so point, velocity, acceleration. Related rates questions should be something that you're able to solve. And L'Hopital's rule for determining limits of indeterminate forms. So in this question here, this is a great example of learning how to, or a great example of the interpreting the meaning of a derivatives in context note that I just mentioned before. So basically, if you were given a situation and at the end of the question, you're given a derivative and asked to explain it, you should know what that derivative means and what's going on in context of the question. And you should be able to explain exactly in context what the question is asking. So in this question, we can go over it in depth here. The temperature of a room in degrees Fahrenheit is modeled by H, a differentiable function of the number of minutes after the thermostat is adjusted. Of the following, which is the best interpretation of H prime of 5 equals 2? A, the temperature of the room is 2 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 minutes after the thermostat is adjusted. B, the temperature of the room increases by 2 degrees Fahrenheit during the first 5 minutes after the thermostat is adjusted. C, the temperature of the room is increasing at a constant rate of 2/5 degree Fahrenheit per minute. And D, the temperature of the room is increasing at a rate of 2 degrees Fahrenheit per minute, 5 minutes after the thermostat is adjusted. So to approach this question, I would look at the equation that we're given at the very end of the question. H prime of 5 is equal to 2. So what this is telling you is that the derivative graph of H, which is the degrees in Fahrenheit in a room, at t equals 5, because in parentheses is 5, we have H prime of 5 is equal to 2. So that means that at 5 minutes, the slope of the function H is 2. So that means that at 5 minutes, the temperature of the room is increasing at 2 degrees Fahrenheit per minute. And as you can see here, looking at the different options, you'll see that D matches exactly what I just mentioned. So you know that the correct answer is D. So one of this is just an example of a question that you might find on interpreting differentiations in context. Another example of a question that might fall into Unit 4 is this question here. This would be an example of using L'Hopital's rule. This is found in the no calculator section. So if you're solving this question, you should know the sine and cosine functions, because when doing this question at the end, after you differentiate and use L'Hopital's rule, you will know that. Well, you will need to know how to find like the cosine of pi or the cosine of 2 pi. So that's just something to keep in mind. In Unit 5 here, this is analytical applications of differentiation. You're expected to know the mean value theorem, the extreme value theorem, the first and second derivative tests, sketching graphs of functions and derivatives, and optimization problems. So for example, in this question here, you have a graphing calculator is required for some questions on this part. I don't think you will need a calculator for this one specifically, but in this question, you're given the graph of f prime above, and the derivative of the function f is shown above. Which of the following could be the graph of f? So this is a good example of sketching graphs of functions and derivatives and the first and second derivatives. So in this graph, you have the graph of the first, or in this question, you have the graph of the first derivative of f, and you want to find the graph of f. So personally, one helpful way of approaching these types of questions for me is by writing everything down that you know by looking at this original graph. So for example, you see that from the interval x from 0 to for x 0 to 1, you see that the graph of f prime is negative or under the x-axis. So that means that it's decreasing, or the original function is decreasing from 0 to 1. And you also see that from 5 to 6, that the graph of f prime is negative. So that means that from 0 to 1 and from 5 to 6, the graph of f will be decreasing. Then you'll see that from 1 to 3 and from 3 to 5, the graph of f, because the graph of f prime is positive, then that means the graph of f will be increasing in that interval. And you'll see that when x is equal to 3, f prime is equal to 0. So that means that when x is 3, f will be constant. Then you see that from the interval 0 to 2, the graph of f prime, so that original graph up there, is increasing. So that means that our original graph from 0 to 2 will be concave up. And you also see that from 3 to 4, it's the same. Then from 2 to 3 and from 4 to 6, you see that the graph of f prime is decreasing, which means that the graph of f will be concave down. So if you take these, everything that I just listed, everything that you notice from, or you can imply from the graph of f prime, you can go through each of the options for the answer and see which one best fits what I just mentioned. And you'll get that A is the best fit for the description that I just mentioned. So that's just one super helpful way to sort of understand how to do these questions. Let's see here. This is the integration and accumulation of change. So in this unit, you will be expected to know how to find Riemann sums, use summation notation, and definite integral notation. You'll be expected to find antiderivatives and indefinite integrals. And you should also know how to integrate by using substitution, long division, and completing the square. And for BC tests, you should also know how to integrate by parts, linear partial fractions, and improper fractions. So here we have this question. Honey is poured through a funnel at a rate of R of T is equal to 4 times E to the negative 0.35 T ounces per minute, where T is measured in minutes. How many ounces of honey are poured through the funnel from time 0 to time T? So this is a pretty basic integration question that you might find in the calculator section. So what you would do, if I have my calculator right here, what you would do is you could easily get the integral notation. You do it from 0 to 3, and then plug in, well, I have the TI Nspire, so I don't know if you guys would do the same for your calculators, but you would set the boundaries from 0 to 3, and the function would be 4 times e to the negative 0.35 t, and then you would do d of dt, and your answer would be 7.429. So that's just a simple integration question that you might be asked, and you might think that it's super easy just because you could just solve it by plugging into your calculator, but it is one of the questions that you might find on the AP. For Unit 7 here, we have differential equations. So through this question, or through this unit, you should be able to model situations with differential equations, verifying solutions for differential equations, sketching slope fields, reasoning using slope fields, approximating solutions using Euler's method, and that's for BC only, finding general solutions using separation of variables, finding particular solutions using initial conditions and separation of variables, exponential models with differential equations, and logistic models with different equations, and that is also for BC only. So in this question here, we are shown a slope field for which of the following differential equations. So to start off here, Just a note that I find that subfields actually get overlooked quite often. I didn't find too many questions like these on the test personally, but this was actually one of my favorite units. So how to solve this one, I would start by looking at the graph and seeing sort of some things that you notice. Something that I notice is that when x is equal to 0, you see that the slopes of the lines all along the y-axis are horizontal, which means that when x is equal to 0, dy over dx is equal to 0. Then you notice that when y is equal to -1, all along that y equals -1 line, we also have horizontal lines, which means that when y is equal to -1, dy dx is also equal to 0. So given sort of what you know, you can plug in different numbers into each of the different solutions. And what you'll find is that A is the only one that supports what I just said. When x is equal to 0, dy dx is 0. And when y is equal to -1, dy dx is also equal to 0. Here we have Unit 8, Applications of Integration. In this unit, you are expected to find areas between curves, functions of x and y, and between curves that intersect at more than 2 points. You should also be able to find different volumes with cross sections and using the disk method and washer method. You should also be able to find the arc length of a smooth planar curve and the distance traveled, and that is for BC only. Something like this for question 10 here would be something that you would find in the no calculator section, just because as you can see from the solutions, the integral signs are still present. So you won't need to plug the integration work into your calculator, and you can usually just solve it by looking at the question itself. So this would be an example of a more complicated no calculator question, but you won't need a calculator to solve it. For Unit 9 here, we have parametric equations, polar coordinates, and vector valued functions. And again, Unit 9 and Unit 10 are just on the BC test. So in this unit, you will need to be able to define and differentiate parametric equations, find a second derivative of them, find arc lengths of curves given by parametric equations, define and differentiate vectors, vector valued functions, integrating vector valued functions, solving motion problems using parametric and vector valued functions, and then finding areas of polar regions and areas of regions bounded by two polar curves. And just a note, this test will not be on the 2020 test due to COVID-19. This is an example of a second derivative question for parametrics. We won't go into it because that would take a lot of time, but this is just an example of one question that might show up about this unit here. For Unit 10 here, we have infinite sequences and series, and again, this is only for BC. The bolded ones are the ones that are still on the 2020 test, but the unbolded ones will not be on the test this year. So normally for Unit 10, you are expected to be able to define convergent and divergent infinite series, to solve for a geometric series, use the nth term test for divergence, use the integral test, comparison test, alternating series test, ratio tests for convergence, know how to use harmonic series and p-series, know the absolute versus conditional convergence, alternating series error bound, Taylor polynomials approximation of functions, know how to use the Lagrange error bound theorem, how to find the radius and interval of convergence of power series, how to find the Taylor or Maclaurin series of a function, and represent functions as power series. So as you can see from Unit 9 and Unit 10, there are a lot of added topics into the test, but for BC tests, but that's just something to keep in mind when you're choosing between taking the AB or BC test. So on to how to. Well, this is one question that might pop up using your convergence test. So moving on to how to study or prepare. Your AP teachers. So my number one tip, I guess, would just be to attend your class. Your AP teachers are following a strict guideline and set of instructions sent by the College Board. So in order to actually test an AP class, I'm pretty sure they have to send in their class schedule and how they plan on teaching um, you as a student. So as long as, and they have to actually get approved by the College Board to be able to say that your class is an AP class. So just know that your teachers at school are super qualified to teach you this AP, about this AP test. So as long as you go to school, if you're able to attend a class, an AP class, just make sure you go to class, take good notes, and you should be pretty all set. Something else that is super helpful is by taking example questions provided by College Board. A quick Google search can help you find a lot of free questions. And while it's sometimes you'll find that it's kind of difficult to find multiple choice questions, and that's just because multiple choice questions are normally harder to create by the College Board and are often reused um, ever so often. So the College Board doesn't usually release a lot of them, but every few years they do release a set. So if you can get your hands on those are super awesome and really helpful. They also do release, every year they do release the free response questions. So just because they're easy to create and think of, and they use new ones every year. So those are definitely super helpful. The link here, I'm pretty sure brings you to the College Board website where they have a whole bunch of example free response exams. And this one brings you to the AB calculus one, but I'm sure if you just do a Google search, you can definitely find the BC ones as well. Another way to study is by looking through other textbooks and study books. There are a ton of textbooks out there for practice questions, so those can be super helpful. But again, I think that the College Board ones are probably just enough. But if you are looking to get that extra practice, I know that a lot of study courses or just they have a lot of books out there that you can buy to or just rent to study and go through each of the questions, and they're pretty helpful in making sure that you know all of the topics that you need to, just to make sure you haven't like left anything out. With Corona this year, a lot of places have also released free online resources. I've added a couple links here. The first one is to the AP YouTube channel. So they recently created a YouTube channel, I believe, and they've begun posting videos of all different topics, including calculus. So those can be super helpful for helping you study. And I'm pretty sure they go over specific free response questions and how to approach them. So that can be super helpful. And the second one is the AP course schedule. I'm pretty sure that brings you to the course schedule of how they're posting the videos on YouTube. I could be wrong. I don't quite remember. But that's just to let you know when they're posting which videos on which day of the week. So that could also be super helpful. Then I know that Khan Academy has for the third link, that's the Khan Academy's AP Calculus BC website. I'm pretty sure they have an AP one, but I could be wrong. But I found that one is super helpful because Khan Academy actually created that course with College Board, so you know that the information on it will be really accurate and be super helpful in preparing you for the actual exam. So I highly recommend that one. And I'm sure if these don't work for you, you could definitely find more online resources, especially now when people are posting them for free to help students these days. So how I personally prepared for the test, again, taking my first advice for myself, I was attentive in class. I took notes. My teacher I found was also really helpful and assigned a lot of practice problems, and they were all practice problems from the College Board in the weeks leading up to the exam, and that was really helpful. And I believe throughout the year, she also assigned us, along with the units that we were learning, she assigned us relevant free response questions to practice on, and that was definitely also really helpful in preparing us for the free response questions. Here, just some calculator skills that you should have when going into this test. You should be able to adjust the viewing window or to zoom in on or zoom out of particular parts of a functions graph. And I guess the prerequisite to that would be just to be able to graph on your calculator. You should also be able to find zeros of a complicated function, for example, to determine where a particle is at rest. You should also be able to evaluate a messy derivative at a specific value, be able to calculate a definite integral, which is what we did before in another question. And I added myself, I thought that NSolve was pretty helpful on my calculator. I'm not sure if all calculators have this, but I got my calculator from school. And if you have a TI Nspire, this is really helpful. If you go to the calculator, you click on Menu, Algebra, Numerical Solve, you can actually plug in equations with like one variable equation and it'll solve it for you. So if you write an equation, for example, like x squared plus 3 is equal to 5, and you do comma x, it only gives you one solution, but it's better than none. And you click enter and it'll actually tell you exactly the solution to the equation that you put in. So I found that to be really helpful when I'm really lazy and I don't want to solve algebraic equations. That's what my calculator is used for these days. Just a couple of test taking tips for pacing. That's super important, especially when this test is super long. If you're having trouble with a question, just don't work on it for too long. It's better to move on and come back to it if you have more time at the end. And personally, I found that skipping questions when needed is really helpful because sometimes I found that later questions actually remind me of how to do the one that I just skipped. And also, studies show that when you move on from a question and you're working on something else, the back of your mind is actually still working on that previous question that you skipped. So when you come back to it, you might just have another idea of how to solve it. For multiple choice questions specifically, it's really important to read the possible answers carefully. I know that in multiple choice questions, some of the possible answers can be really quite similar, so you want to make sure that you know the differences between them in order to actually choose the correct answer. Then my third tip for multiple choice is to use the process of elimination and to guess. Just know that for multiple choice questions on the AP, you don't have a penalty for guessing or getting an answer wrong. So when possible, always try to use the process of elimination to narrow down your answers. And then when you absolutely need to, you can guess because you won't get penalized for it. For free response questions, one of the main test taking tips for that is to show your work. So in free response questions, most of the times you're not just graded on whether or not you get the correct answer, but also on the work that you have. So making sure that you show your work is super important so that you can get partial credit. Even if your final answer is incorrect, but your grader can see that your thought process and your initial work was correct, you can get partial credit. And vice versa, if you only show the final answer and you show no work on the free response questions, sometimes you can only get partial credit because the grader doesn't know what you've done to get that answer. And again, similar to multiple choice questions for free response questions, always read the question carefully, as you should with all questions. A couple common mistakes that are, I guess, pretty relevant is PVA, or position velocity acceleration. You want to remember that the derivative of position is velocity, the derivative of velocity is acceleration, and then you can go the other way as well. And under that, you should know the difference between velocity and speed. It's really easy to confuse those two, but velocity, remember, has magnitude, whereas velocity has direction, whereas speed is just a magnitude. So you could have a negative 3.5 miles per hour velocity, but you can't have a speed of negative 3.5. Then the second tip for common mistakes is forgetting to add C when integrating. Personally, my teacher, when I took the course, She threatened to take off points on tests when you forgot your plus C or your constant. I didn't like it in the beginning, but definitely found it super helpful on the exam day, because when I was taking the test, I didn't even have to think about writing plus C. It just came to me. But I know that the College Board does take constants pretty seriously, so you should always just try to remember to write plus C when you're taking the test and integrating. Number 3 is to show your work. Again, as I said before, you can always get partial credit for showing your work on free response questions. And also, when you do in your free response questions, you should try to be pretty neat so that the AP reader can understand your writing. And yeah, for the 4th tip is, one mistake that people commonly use is overusing the ln of x rule. So some of you might know that the integral of 1 over x is ln of x plus c. But we can't always use that rule for everything. For example, if we had 1 over x squared plus 1, that the integral of that isn't equal to ln of x squared plus 1, or however you would integrate that. But it's actually equal to arctangent plus c. So just remember that just because you have a fraction with 1 over something doesn't mean that its integral will always be ln of x. Then the next thing is confusing series and sequences. I guess this is just for the BC test takers, but remember that a series or a sequence is a list of numbers written in a definite order, whereas a series is a sequence or like a lot of numbers added together. So there's a big difference here, but a lot of the questions might try to trick you, so just be aware of that. And for a final common mistake is forgetting to write units, especially in the free response questions. Well, I guess that would be the only part where it's relevant, but writing units for questions for your answers are really important. The College Board does take off points on that, so read your question carefully and know what units to put on for it. And that was the end of the presentation. So do you guys have any questions or anything? I'll stop sharing. But if you guys have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat, or I guess that's it. But did I take the A, B, or BC? I took the BC exam. Yeah, I didn't find that it was super difficult, but you should think about it carefully, because I do have some friends who took the AB one and they were happy doing that as well. So I guess it depends what you're sort of looking for and if you want to be super challenged or not. Yeah.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then that's just going to be the end of today's session. So thanks everyone for showing up. And as always, thank you for donating to the MGH to my cause. I really appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a great week. Thank you all and goodbye.